The Ship Island Storm. Chapter 1. The wood planks below my feet felt as if someone had lit a fire beneath them. I could feel both my heels starting to swell and harden with callus. At this rate, it would be no time before the soles of my feet would be blistered and swollen. I had walked this never-ending pier several times in the past, but never had it felt as hot as it did on this midsummer scorcher. Being as this was far from our first trip to Ship Island, we had quite an advantage on the tourists on how and when to travel across the island. We occasionally got a good laugh when we caught one of the newer tourists making one of our novice mistakes, like coming out of the fort looking for the snack bar. All things considered, I was still holding my head high and moving briskly down the pier, pompously displaying a new sense of confidence and liberation in my stride. I had learned all the various island techniques for making sure that my feet did not get burnt, while trying to make it across this intolerable bridge of flames. This particular pier spanned the entire width of the island and had no shade coverage from the moment it left one beach until it reached the beach on the other side. The heated planks that span between the two beaches, while concealing the island's protected marshland, also effectively absorb all of the sun's devastating rays. This, in turn, allows adequate shade for the plethora of critters that live beneath to thrive and grow. The wetlands on this island have yielded most everything imaginable throughout the years, from cute little raccoons to huge terrifying alligators. Many say the alligator was brought over in Camille, the Category 5 hurricane that demolished the Gulf Coast. The storm's destructive range started in Pa Christian and extended east as far as Pascagoula, Mississippi. This unimaginable storm was the reason Ship Island is no longer in one piece. The storm tore right through the middle of the island, taking trees, rocks, dirt and even sand straight into the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico. It created a giant gap between what is now referred to as East and West Ship and spans over a mile wide. The gap has since been used by fishermen as a shortcut out to sea and is now referred to as Camille's Cut. That hurricane was in 1969 though, while I was not born until 1971. My father still keeps the newspaper articles though, as a reminder, he says, of how quickly Mother Nature can turn the tides. Looking up at my father anxiously, I knew he could tell it was time we found a place to stop and cool our feet. Observing my dad, I could easily recognize that I was not the only one eager to stop and cool my feet. My dad's feet were stepping even more quickly now, and I noticed that when traffic halted he would strategically run in place. I thought he looked like someone training for the Olympics on a crowded sidewalk, and I chuckled to myself at the sight. This was truly a novice technique, but hey, I thought whatever works. Before long I had his novice technique down and was ready to switch to expert, as if I were playing an old Atari game that no longer presented a challenge. Although I was feeling quite distressed, I tried not to let it show. In the screechy voice of a teen getting ready for puberty, combined with the rhythmic vibration of each step I took on the pier, I managed to declare in certain defeat. The closest rinsing faucet is not until the halfway point. I know. My dad hollered back, I'm on it. I always knew when we had reached the halfway point on the pier because of the white triangle sign that was pointing west towards the picnic grounds. There was a turnoff that you could follow up to an overpriced hamburger and hot dog joint. The picnic tables were worn down, but they did have their own little pavilions, steel charcoal grills and rinsing faucets. A rinsing faucet, although a very pleasant thought, was clearly not an option. It was apparently time to move on down the list of tricks. Before I could say it, I noticed that my dad was already looking down at the wooden planks. He was not concentrating on the planks right below his feet, but instead further in front of him between the thick, colorful crowd of tourists ahead. He was looking for a cool spot. A cool spot is a place that someone else has stopped to cool down, either with a water bottle or a cooler, prior to your arrival. Most likely they were trying to relieve their own case of hot feet. The problem is, if you don't get to the cool spot immediately, the ice will melt and the water will evaporate or leak between the cracks of the pier. Feeling very amateuristic, I thought to myself, everyone knows that you should bring a water bottle to wet your feet down on hot piers. I rolled up on my toes to give my heels a chance to cool. What am I doing on this pier, in the middle of the blazing hot sun, with no foot protection, no water to cool my burning hot soles? I thought curiously to myself. Well, to tell you the truth, before now, all of our trips have been Ship Island excursions. This trip was different. A Ship Island excursion is where you pay a minimal fee to board a very large ship that leaves out of the Gulfport harbor, transferring passengers to and from the island. There are 2 boats that rotate shifts throughout the day, bringing passengers to the island as early as 9 a.m. and evening departure as late as 5 p.m. The famous Gulfport Island attracts many tourists because it is the home of the military Fort Massachusetts, which was designed in 1812 to defend New Orleans and the greater Gulf Coast. We diligently maneuvered back and forth between the tourists like scurrying ants herding across a small branch over a river, while being hurried by a hungry aardvark. I was gazing up at the brilliant sun, that seemed to be directly overhead, when I heard my father say, "Move to the right, son, there is a cool spot coming up." Stopping abruptly seemed to irritate those passing by, but they were of course, wearing shoes. We, on the other hand, had not exactly planned to be here, at least not now anyway. Ship Island is one of my father's favorite islands. He says it because of the wisdom the island has to share. My dad has always been kind of a history buff, so, even though we've seen it 100 times, he still likes to take us in the fort and tell us all about it. Sadly, on this very hot morning, although I cannot for the life of me remember why, Fort Massachusetts was not open to the public. My dad decided that rather than go straight back to the boat, we could go check out the other side of the island, and since it looked as though there was no mind-numbing history lesson involved, I decided to take him up on his adventure. It was a walk on the beach or meet up with my mom and brothers by the boat. I vividly remembered how earlier this morning both my younger brothers were out of sorts with each other, and to tell you the truth, my stepmom wasn't in the greatest of moods either. So, deciding to go with my father was a no-brainer. After a long brisk walk of about 200 yards, we reached the beach on the south side of the island. The pier faded off almost flush with the pure white sand. Footprints were everywhere in all shapes and sizes. Tourists were pulling out drinks and sitting down under huge umbrellas. I heard my dad take a deep breath, then I followed him as he walked towards the crystal blue water. Kids were yelling and throwing beach balls, while parents were yelling and waving their arms. The huge waves rolled in one after the other, getting louder as we got closer to the shore. The soft, light sand that had previously fallen effortlessly between my toes now began to squeak as I reached the edge of the water. I crinkled my toes, grabbing up some sand and flung it forward into an oncoming wave, and watched as my father emulated me. After a brief moment of playing in the sand, my father and I walked along the shore to the west, letting the cool waves hit our ankles and cover our feet. Finally, we took a spot about 25 yards off the shore and just stared out into the ocean, and although it seemed we would stand there forever, I just made the best of it, digging in the sand around my dad's feet. It was around 12:45 p.m. when my dad felt he had basked long enough in the salt air blowing in off the Gulf. I could tell he felt completely indulged, like a wolf with its cub standing over a beautiful mountainside. He had his son beside him, sharing the smell, feel and taste of the fresh salt air. My dad always told me that the ocean was forever, and that throughout the years its entirety has effortlessly engulfed, partitioned and categorized the world. He always followed up by saying that the ocean had done so without effort throughout the years and at its own timely discretion. He would say that the ocean interacts with the sky like a pitcher playing catch with the clouds, and that brilliantly, this was the ocean's valiant attempt to filter as much negative energy as possible from the air, before excreting the remainder, to be delivered via the winds back to the mainland. The end product, he would boast, is a salty sweet aroma that is bestowed upon all the fishermen of the Gulf. These brief moments of silence, conjectured by a parley of unanswerable questions, which could only be thought up by a 13-year-old boy, were the ones I knew he cherished the most. As we headed back towards the pier, I had noticed that the temperature of the sand beneath my feet had begun to elevate, but not yet to the point of being hot. About 10 feet up the pier it widened about 6 feet on either side to allow for shower heads to be installed. These were for people to rinse the salt and sand from their bodies before they made the extremely long walk down the pier when heading back towards the boat. They had a large silver button which you press to start the very cold rinsing process. The water only flowed for about 20 seconds, so it was always necessary to press the button 2 or 3 times to get thoroughly rinsed off. My dad and I just had to rinse our feet, so we did not hold up the line very long. It was then time to make the long jaunt back down the pier.